All right, it's my pleasure to now bring to you a coughing Annika Rohrabacher and her paper comparing Plato's Republic to John Locke's ideal government.
John Locke and Plato, two immensely impactful philosophers of their respective times, were best known for their works, the two treatises of government and the Republic. The books detailed the formation of their ideal forms of government and how they believed it would best be run. Plato, being from ancient Greece, and Locke from Enlightenment-era Europe, held two very different ideas towards what they believed would be the perfect government. John Locke believed in a limited government that focused on protecting life, liberty, and property that represented the people. Plato alternatively followed a more authoritarian belief in government where he believed the wisest of the philosophers should rule the country, with a more collective approach to property and public services. Plato's utopian beliefs idealized the perfect leader and outlined the structure of authority within the government. Locke, being from the Age of Enlightenment, was a proponent of constitutionalism and went to greater detail about the role of government. The two also differed on their descriptions of government, with Plato being more specific in describing governmental structure and Locke explaining the laws and rights of men. Although Locke and Plato's philosophies seem to be the opposite from one another, they have some similarities. The main parallel between the two was their shared focus on the government's promotion and protection of justice. However, the Enlightenment philosopher and classical era philosopher also believed in the importance of the government emphasizing and promoting moral education while ruling with virtue. They believed that in order for the citizens of a country to properly participate in society, they must be educated to understand their place and role. Overall, Locke and Plato's philosophies regarding government have enlightened people throughout the ages on how government can function and help achieve the greater good. In order to properly compare Locke and Plato's ideal form of government, it is essential to understand how their surroundings and their time period influenced them. Plato, studying philosophy at Socrates' school in Athens, was clearly influenced by his peers and teacher. Of course, all of the philosophers during the classical period of ancient Greece, Socrates was especially pivotal towards the development of Plato's philosophies, as he was his teacher for several years. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be wiser still. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. While Socrates held opinions reaching across several topics, it was his ideas regarding virtue and politics that especially influenced Plato's writings and further impacted his opinions outlined in the Republic. Like Plato, Socrates was critical of democracy, believing it was an idealist and unrealistic form of government that would place too much control within the citizens of the country, who would use their power to elect inadequate leaders because of their lack of education and wisdom. Foolish leaders of democracy, which is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. In the same manner, Plato's ideal form of government, Socrates believed that philosophers should be the prime leaders of the government with the wisest and complete control. Socrates further held that until philosophers took the place as rulers and kings of all the countries, the troubles of mankind would never cease. There will be no end to the troubles of the states or of humanity itself until philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands. Like Plato, John Locke also drew inspiration from his time period as well, which is known as the Enlightenment today. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was a time of transition from old ideas to the new, where people in Europe were advancing in scientific and philosophical ideas that challenged authority and the establishment. Although John Locke was one of the most impactful philosophers and supporters of the Enlightenment, he also drew inspiration from his Enlightenment contemporaries. One of the more impactful Enlightenment figures relating to his philosophies was Charles de Montesquieu, who, like Locke, inspired the American founding fathers in the formation of the American government. They did this by promoting limited government and the separation of powers, which is the basis of the American government today. Charles de Montesquieu held that the best way to achieve limited government was to separate it into different bodies with equal power, as this would ensure one group of people did not hold an excess amount of power that could be misused. The political liberty of the subject is a tranquility of mind arising from the opinion each person has of safety. In order to have this liberty, it is requisite for the government to be so constituted as one need not to be afraid of the other. Although John Locke agreed with this idea, he argued in favor of two branches of government, the executive and the legislature. Although Montesquieu held the same belief, he differed from Locke as he was in favor of three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Both believed that the citizens, who Montesquieu and Locke believed should be the sole beneficiaries and providers of power, held more rights when the government was limited and less imposing on their personal lives. John Locke and Charles de Montesquieu believed that the government should be limited. Its role should be focused towards maintaining a strong law and order, establishing political liberty and tolerance, and protecting the property of its citizens. Although John Locke and Charles de Montesquieu believed in democracy, they both knew that no matter what type of government was in control, there would always be risk of tyranny if power went into the hands of the wrong person. Democratic and aristocratic states are not in their own nature free. Political liberty is to be found only in the moderate governments, and even in these, it is not always found. It is only when there is no abuse of power, but constant experience shows us that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it, and to carry his authority as far as it will go. Despite the slight risk that the role of government proposed, they believed their ideal form of government, especially the theory regarding the separation of powers, would minimize the risk of tyranny the greatest. Most importantly, the Enlightenment philosophers' ideal forms of government were centered around the people's best interest and their individual rights as citizens of a country. John Locke's theories on individual freedom and the limited role of government, while revolutionary during his time, was clearly influenced by his fellow Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu. The same could be equated for Plato, as Athens during the classical Greek period was a prominent place and time for philosophers to share their ideas with each other. Philosophy was so prevalent in Athens that the students and teachers of philosophy alike would build their philosophies upon one another's beliefs. Overall, while their philosophies are completely original, it is essential to recognize the era and people who guided Plato and John Locke in order to understand their point of view. Locke and Plato undoubtedly held very different ideas towards what they believed an ideal government should look like. Similar to Socrates, Plato believed in an authoritarian government where the wisest philosophers held an aristocratic regime over Locke's ideal of a democratic representative government where the citizens held individual rights. One of the main differences between John Locke and Plato's philosophies regarding government were their beliefs around property ownership. Private property was an immensely important focus in Locke's works. This was especially in regard to the government, as he believed that one of the government's primary duties was to protect and to preserve the citizens' land and property. Thirdly, the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent, for the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men entered into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that people should have property, without which they must be supposed to lose that by entering into society, which was the end for which they entered into it. Too gross an absurdity for any man to own. Locke, a firm believer in natural law, believed that land was guaranteed to people in nature, but only to those who worked the land. Locke explained that if one contributed to the land and worked hard toward the property, they had a right to own the land, as the work was what made the property theirs. Whatsoever, when he removes out of the state of nature, hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him and removed from the common state nature placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where that is enough and as good left in the common for others. Excuse me. This greatly contrasted his position on property ownership, as he believed in communal land. He explains his version of property ownership by detailing how the public would share the land around them rather than an individual owning and retaining the land for themselves. Plato believed that communal ownership would result in unity and justice for the people while preventing conflicts because property would no longer be theirs to fight about. Another difference among Plato and Locke were their beliefs on liberty. Liberty being one of the founding principles in Locke's ideal government is an important theme in Locke's two treatises of government. As previously stated, Locke was a massive proponent of natural law, where he believed that humans are born with certain inalienable rights that the government is responsible to protect. One of these rights is liberty, where Locke holds that every man is born into perfect freedom. The natural liberty of a man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. Plato, however, holds that liberty is a dangerous leading principle for any government to follow. He explains further by stating how the spirit of liberty knows no bounds or authority, and how it will go to great lengths to destroy moral superiority. Excess of liberty, where it lies in the state or individuals, seems only to pass into excess of slavery. Plato argues that people, similar to the right to vote with democracy, will abuse their freedom to commit wrongful and invirtuous acts. Dictatorship naturally arises out of democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny is slavery out of the most extreme liberty. The spirit of liberty knows no authority, going to all lengths to dismantle all that is sacred or has pretensions to moral superiority. Finally, the last and perhaps the most important difference to be written about Locke and Plato's ideal form of government is their idea around the citizen's role in the direction of the government. While Locke was a firm believer of liberty and property rights, he was surprisingly hesitant around allowing those without property to participate in the process of democracy. He explained how the law hardly pertained to them, as it was out of the government's jurisdiction to protect or promote anything other than life, liberty, and property. He further held that their lack of property ownership made them unfit to participate in the government. Plato, on the other hand, was much different from Locke, where in his ideal form of government, people would be separated by different classes, which would dictate your role within the government process. There are three classes in Plato's ideal government: the producers, the auxiliaries, and the guardians. The guardians, otherwise known as the philosopher kings, are the smallest but most important class because they are tasked with ruling the city or the country. The artillery are next to the most important, as they protect the country from invaders and keep the peace. They enforce the laws and orders of the guardians and make the producers obey. The guardians also are chosen from the artillery. The last class are the producers, which make up everyone else in the population. They are tasked with obeying the guardians and following their commands. Plato further separates each class with a specific type of soul. The guardians, being the highest class, are described as souls with souls of gold, the auxiliary with souls of silver, and the producers with souls of bronze or iron. John Locke and Plato, while completely different, have some similarities which make their quest to describe their ideal governments, and comparing them all the more interesting. Locke and Plato are often synonymous with one another, as both intently studied and philosophized about different forms of government. While the core of their beliefs differs from one another, there are a few similarities between the two. One of the main correlations is between the philosophers pertains to their opinions surrounding justice. Justice plays an important role in both ideal governments described in Plato's The Republic and Locke's two treatises of government. Justice is a consistent theme in Plato's writings and is described as an imperative human virtue. In order for the state to act in virtue, Plato states that it must endure within the souls of its citizens. Justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the heart and souls of its citizens. Plato further emphasizes the importance of government's use of justice by encouraging the government to promote it and exercise the right. In promoting justice, Plato believed the government was promoting life and ensuring peace for the people. John Locke coincided with this belief, as he promoted justice and saw it as a natural right and concept. He believed that human beings were inclined to promote the ideal, and that with the implementation of strong but not overbearing laws, justice could be promoted. Both John Locke and Plato were also in agreement regarding education, in the government using virtue. While John Locke believed in limited government intervention, he shared Plato's belief that the government should provide proper education to its citizens. This would ensure the citizens could better understand their individual rights and contribute to society, as detailed in the social contract per Locke's case, Plato held that this would make them valued members of their community and they would be able to make wiser decisions. With education, both philosophers held that the citizens were better equipped to lead better lives and make a difference in one's community. It was the government's role to ensure its citizens had a good quality of life, and a proper education was the path to that. Locke further believed that it was a natural right, and while Plato believed people should be required to be educated in certain matters before making decisions or voting. Locke and Plato are often synonymous with one another, as both intensely studied about different forms of government. Although they were alike in that respect, the premise of their beliefs are mainly different from one another. While the core of their beliefs is somewhat separate from one another, there are a few similarities between the two. One of the main correlations between, I just read that part again. So, what was the point? Although, I'm gonna read right here, I might repeat myself, I kind of lost track.
Yeah, you're on the third sentence of the paragraph that begins Locke and Plato.
Let me see.
The paragraph that begins Locke and Plato, you're the third sentence, one of the main correlations.
One of the main correlations between the philosophers pertains to their opinions surrounding justice. Justice plays an important role in both ideal governments described in Plato's The Republic and Locke's The Second Treatise of Government. Justice plays a consistent role in Plato's writings as, I feel like I printed out the same page, or like it won't do the thing, but he continues by explaining how the use of justice is not meant to benefit an individual, but rather the community or society as a whole. Our purpose to finding our state was not to promote the happiness of a single class, but so far as possible of the whole community. Our idea was that we were most likely to be just such a community, and so able to decide the question we were trying to answer. We are likely to be just such a community, and so able to decide the question we are trying to answer. We are therefore at the moment trying to construct what we think is a happy community by securing the happiness not of a select minority but that of the whole. Plato believed justice was an asset to the government because it kept people in line and following the state's authority. Although justice does not have a consistent theme in the Second Treatise of Government, it is compared to the Republic, as much of a consistent theme as compared to the Republic. It still plays an important role in Locke's ideal government. Locke, while not exactly viewing justice in the same light as Plato, found justice to be inconceivable without property ownership. Without personal land or property, there is no justice. Locke further holds that if one man harms or violates another, he must be put in his place and face justice for his crime or misdoing. Besides the crime which consists in violating the law, in varying from the right rule of reason, whereby a man so far becomes degenerate and declares himself to quit the principles of human nature and to be a noxious creature, there is commonly injury done to some person or other, and other man receives damage by his transgression, in which he hath received any damage, has besides the right of punishment common with him, with other men, a particular right to seek separation from him that has done it, and any other person who finds it just may also join him that is injured and assist him in recovering from the offender so much as he may make satisfaction for the harm he has suffered. Excuse me. Another important theme that is discussed similarly between Locke and Plato is that of virtue. Both John Locke and Plato stress the importance of a government strong in virtue. Plato defined virtue into 4 categories: courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. He firmly held that a leader or philosopher king should contain within their leadership. John Locke also agreed within the importance of virtue directed in the government and workings in society, defining virtue with the statement, "Virtue is everywhere that which is thought praiseworthy, and nothing else but that which has the allowance of public esteem is called virtue." Finally, Locke and Plato were alike, where they both agreed that the citizens of the country should be thoroughly and properly educated. The importance of education was strongly emphasized in both Locke and Plato's works, as they believed that the people should be educated before partaking in government matters. Plato saw education of vital importance because he saw it as a means to justice, which is the most important virtue of the four he described. He held that education was a means to achieving justice both socially and individually. He further espoused that it was a lack of education that was the stem root of tyranny and injustice from different governments across the world. Education is the constraining and directing of youth towards that of right reason, which law affirms and which the experience of the best of our elders has agreed to be truly right. Locke also stressed the importance of education, where he wrote a separate work titled Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which he then published. The book was immensely popular, and it describes his belief about how citizens of a country need proper education. Without education, they can effectively serve their country and contribute to society. Overall, while it may seem that Locke and Plato are completely different in their perspectives and approaches to philosophy, they are much more alike in context than one might think. Plato and John Locke have truly shaped the course of history by their philosophies of government. Without them, the governments that we see today and from the past would be very different, and history likewise would have gone an alternative path. John Locke, although unlike Plato, in the core of his values of an ideal government, was impacted by the classical philosopher who used his work as inspiration for his own writings. Both laid an enormous foundation for Western society and government, with the Republic and the Second Treatise of Government. During the classical philosophy period in which Socrates taught Plato in the school of Athens was running at its highest potential, Plato gained valuable knowledge and perspective in which he used to build the foundations of his philosophies, which he published. John Locke was as previously stated, built much of his philosophy on Plato, as well as many other Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers of his time. Although Plato supported an authoritarian aristocracy as opposed to John Locke's representative democracy, the two shared similarities on the social contract of things. While Plato did not necessarily have a social contract, he would have agreed in how it described justice and the use of virtue within the government, which he described in his book, The Republic, as well. He also would have appreciated Locke's view on education. Overall, Locke and Plato, while very different from one another, impacted Western civilization for the better by inspiring others with their descriptions of their
Thank you very much, Ms. Rohrabacher. You're developing a number of similarities and contrasts between,
I was just going to ask before I get can I get some water?
Yes. You know what? I think we can take a 2-minute break while I go get a glass of water. I think I should probably do that. So let's just bite the bullet here, and I will go get one.
And then I said like a full
How about that? All right.
We go back. We go back next week. The East Coasters are making arrangements.
All right, Ms. Rohrabacher, back to our regular programming, glass of water in hand. You developed a number of interesting comparisons between Locke and Plato. And could you give us what you think is the most significant similarity between them and the most significant contrast between them?
So I think the most significant contrast has got to be the types of government that they find the most ideal. Locke is in favor of, let me put up on this real quick. Locke is a proponent of constitutionalism, while Plato is more of a proponent of authoritarianism. And Locke is more about the rights of man, and he talks about how every man is born with the inalienable right of life, liberty, and property. And Plato disagrees with that altogether. He doesn't believe that man should have liberty or freedom because that can lead to tyranny and the abuse of that freedom. He believes that that humans would abuse their freedom, versus Locke, he believes everyone should be born with the right to have freedom. I would say their biggest similarity would probably be about how they both are really big in promoting education, and how they believe that every citizen should have a proper education if they want to contribute to society or be an apt member of society. And I also, I would say that would be their biggest similarity.
Okay. Also, can you say a little bit more as to why education seems to have such a necessary connection to good government in both of these guys' thinking? Why is education important to good government?
Because Plato just talks about how tyranny is usually as a result of, he talks about how democracy is the kind of the stem of tyranny, but he talks about how usually those who, he believes that people who are uneducated will be more likely to vote for someone or support somebody who would manipulate them in their own self-interest to have power. And Locke believes that people need to be educated to understand their rights and how to protect their rights, and to kind of recognize the rights that they are born with and how the government needs to protect those rights. I don't know if that answered your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's clear. I'm not so much sure how much it's true under Locke, but under Plato, he has a very strong notion that the government needs to shape the moral capacities of the people, and even so far as to what sort of music that they listen to. He says that there's some music that will, noble strains that will inspire them towards patriotism of their country, and others that will inspire them towards having too much love of pleasure and being degenerate. And I'm not sure if that's what you meant by Plato being tyrannical, but I wanted to ask you in general just your own thought as to how important it is for a government to try to shape the moral inclinations of its citizens.
I think that laws are meant to promote certain ethics and morals in which the citizens need to follow. So in that way, the government, in a way, sort of shapes the morals because it is required for citizens to follow the law. But I personally do not believe that the government has a right or a place to shape citizens' morals. I think that that's their own personal business. However, I think that it should be it's the individual citizen's business what their morals is, because everyone holds different morals and what they think is right or wrong, and unless it's affecting another person negatively, the government should not be involved in. And so in that regard, I agree with Locke, where the government should have limited interference as much as possible in someone's personal life and how they perceive things.
Yeah, take something like pornography. In the state of California, we have certain limits on what you can purchase. Seems to be that the internet's kind of gotten around most of that, but there was an attempt to limit what people, particularly people under the age of 18, could purchase. And with something like that, it seems like that'd be a very natural thing for Plato to say, yep, we need to have a virtuous populace, and therefore we should have the government making laws against this. Now, with Locke, are you saying that Locke would say that anything that only hurts yourself, degrades your own morality, should not have any legislation regarding it, or is the fact that something is simply immoral enough that there should be a law against it?
Well,
Even if you perhaps can participate in it without actively hurting someone else.
well, in terms of the pornography thing with minors, I think obviously if there's a minor, I think that the government should somewhat work towards shaping the morals or the ethics of like a minor and like their decisions. Like you don't want minors going off and drinking alcohol or doing drugs, for example, like I would say. Wait, can you ask that question again? I just lost track for a second.
Yeah, Plato seems to think it's very important for the government to shape the morality of the people. And I mean, there's actually a law right now in the California Assembly that make it very difficult for police to prosecute prostitutes. And, we visited Reno a lot, and I always thought, you know what, at least in California we keep some things illegal. And I always thought it's kind of a good idea that we keep prostitution illegal. But with the view of Locke that you're giving here, it seems to be saying that, well, this is a consensual activity. One person gets money, the other person gets pleasure. And so this shouldn't be, the government should not be trying to tell people what their morality should be. And so anyway, I have always thought that this was a good thing that the state of California did not allow this activity, the activity of prostitution. But are you saying that, if something is just a matter of morality, that the government should not have any or it's tyrannical for the government to limit that activity if it doesn't actively damage another human being?
I agree with Locke. I'm not saying I'm in favor of prostitution or anything like that, but I agree with Locke where he believes that the government should only really interfere into someone's life if it affects life, liberty, or their property, and if those rights are in danger. And so I think that there should be as much limited interference in the government's in people's personal lives as possible, and that would include in moral situations because everyone has different morals. Like we hold Christian morals, which can be universal for Christians. Everyone holds different religions and where they believe that their morals are different from others, and I don't think that who's one to say to have like an authority over someone else's own decisions if it doesn't hurt anyone else. If it hurts someone else, then I 100% understand that. And I also don't necessarily think that prostitution has like consent entirely. I just think that, I don't know. Personally, I think that that's innately wrong and that should be illegal. But more like, I think like it harms other people and it puts people at risk. So
Yeah, I guess.
I would say that.
I just wondering how much morality is the bulwark of a strong nation. And my father is 87 years old, and he did not meet a divorced person until he was in college. And 1968, that wonderful Republican Ronald Reagan brought no-fault divorce to the state of California, meaning that people can get divorced without having to give cause. That used to be that you had to give a cause while you were divorcing. And our family structure has been really a mess in our culture, and that seemed to be weakening our culture. And it's wondering if we're not willing to fight for the morality of our people, does that ultimately mean that our nation will be weakened? And so if you take something like divorce, it may seem very tyrannical to say, no, you get married, you have to stay married. But will you lose the strength of a nation if you don't actively pursue things that will shape the morality of your people?
I think that, yes, I think that I'm a firm believer in like the family nucleus, like a nucleus family, and I'm against divorce personally myself. If I get married someday, I think that divorce is wrong, and I would not want to get divorced under unless there's like certain circumstances, obviously. But I think that it's kind of the culture's or the society's decision as a whole, and it's not the government's role to intercede with those decisions, because once you give the government leeway into people's personal lives and free reign like that, that could lead to some dangerous, that can lead to some dangerous territory where the government can abuse their rights and they could become authoritarian and tyrannical.
All right, thank you. Other questions?
A very interesting paper. I don't know, I have a lot of questions. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. But I think I want to focus it on sort of justice in that question and what both governments point to. So Plato's Republic begins with asking the question, what does justice in the soul look like? And then Socrates says, well, let me give you an analogy with this government, as if this government is the soul, and this is what justice looks like, and they work that out from there. And so it points to a sort of justice in which too much liberty devolves into tyranny. You know, you have democracy where everybody is given like more liberty than what they ought in Socrates' mind, and that devolves into this sort of overindulging of the appetite, and then you become a tyrant, and then you have this sort of person who is enslaved to their appetite. So that points to a sort of justice that says that liberty is only good insofar as it is ordered, you know, and anything outside of that devolves into tyranny. So I can see that very clearly in your paper, but what sort of justice is Locke's form of government pointing to in advocating for liberty as the end of government?
So Locke believes that, here, I put the quote up because I actually quoted this in my paper. Sorry, I actually have the quote up here. I'm just trying to find it. Okay, so Locke will not exactly view injustice in the same light as Plato found justice to be inconceivable without property ownership. And so without personal land or property, there is no justice. So in a way, justice is if someone wrongs you, or like let's say someone steals your land, or your personal property, then you have a right to go over and take that back. Like that, I think that he believes it's more on like a personal note rather than like an innate like human virtue like Plato described. I think he's more talking about like personal circumstances where someone does something unjust, and so justice would be correcting that injustice done to the person, I guess you can say. I don't know if that answers your question.
So what sort of safeguard then exists in Locke's government for liberty to go checked so it doesn't devolve into one person taking everything from everyone else?
Well, it talks about Locke believed in a strong government that protected life, liberty, and property, and so it's not, when I said like the person takes back their land and so per se, I mean more like it's the government's role that's one of the government's few roles. They have to protect justice by protecting life, liberty, and property. Anything damaged or done to someone's own life, liberty, and property, it's the government's role to go and right the injustice done to that person, and to ensure that those rights, inalienable rights as guaranteed by God, which Locke believed the natural law is protected.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think I'm following it.
Okay, sorry, I'm not the best at explaining, but any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask you more about the concept of Locke and land. You had given his definition of land ownership, and it said Locke explains that if one contributed to the land and worked hard toward the property, they had a right to own the land, as the work was what made the property theirs. And so it seems for Locke that working the land has a big part in determining who owns the land. And I always thought this was very interesting, is just what this does to the good old American Indians and their hunter-gatherer mentality, where they seem to kind of move around on fairly large tracts of land. They would still have a sense of ownership of it. They would fight other tribes for it. And yet, they don't really seem to farm the land. They don't seem to work the land. They simply seem to hunt the land. Without that ability to contribute and work on the land, is there no possibility that they have of land ownership?
There's still technically, I believe that when Locke said working the land, I think he meant more like using the land in a way. And I think that if you hunt what's on your land, like for example, we have chickens at my house, and like we have a garden as well, but let's say we just had our garden, we have chickens now, and like we're taking care of the chickens are using the land, and like we use them for food, and so I would still say like the land is ours because our we're using the land and we are working the land with, I think like, I would say that like the American Indians are working the land by hunting on it and receiving the benefits from it, but they believed in like communal ownership, which is like really similar to what Plato believed in. He believed in communal ownership. He didn't believe in like property rights or anything that Locke listed. So I think that they didn't exactly own the land themselves. It was more like the tribe, and it was more of a communal ownership in a way. So it wasn't necessarily like they owned the land in a way. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, you bring up your own land. I was thinking the example of, most likely you built a house on the land, or the previous owner built a house on it. There's a driveway, there's, a lawn, there's lots of things that you did to that land. Now, thinking of a hunter-gatherer, puts up a teepee up there for a few weeks, moves on, and doesn't seem to substantially improve the land any. Now, an American settler comes along, builds a cabin, plants a field, and the Indian wants to come through again and say, this is my land, I've been hunting this land for generations. It seems like Locke is saying the farmer can look at that hunter-gatherer and say, no, I planted the field, I will get 100 times the harvest off this land than you ever could have, and it's mine.
I mean, they didn't claim the land either. I mean, I'm sure the settler that came in like has certain papers that list that it's theirs, and they actually, he works the land as well, and he lives there continuously throughout the years rather than move around. Like if someone just moves around constantly, it's not like they legitimately own the land. They're not staying there. They're not necessarily they're reaping the benefits from the land, which I think like that can show how I feel like that's some way contributing to the land, but I don't think they're not staying in the same spot, which I'm trying to say. It's not like they're always there and that they're living there, so that doesn't make it theirs. The fact that the settler came in and he lives there year round and he continuously works the land and he's there continuously, like he lives there, makes that his land. And I think that
I've always found that persuasive, that you sort of own the land by working it, and the American Homestead Act seemed to imply the same thing. If you go on a piece of land and work it for 5 years, it would be yours. And but it also made me wonder about something like big tech executive who's going to buy 10,000 acres in Montana just as a land investment. He's going to go buy 10,000 acres. Now, is he going to do anything with it? No. He's just going to own it, and it's going to be an investment. He doesn't work it. Is it proper that the government comes to him and says, you know what, we've got 45 farmers who we'd like to put on this land, and your ownership has been forfeited by the fact you have not worked this land?
I think that's wrong because he worked hard for his money that he used to buy the land, and so that would make the land his. Like he technically worked for the land by working hard for the money that he then used to buy the land. And even if that doesn't necessarily mean that he physically worked on the land, he still technically worked for it because he worked for the money that he used to buy it or to contain it.
Okay, so you would say it's not necessary to actually have any work upon the land itself to be able to say that you have a rightful claim to it that can last.
Yes, I have friends who own several homes, and some maybe visit that home maybe once a year. Sometimes they don't even visit it at all, hardly, like it's been touched for years. They still have house cleaners that go in and clean it and etc. But they don't they don't go there and live there. That doesn't make the house belong to the house cleaners. That they still work hard for the money that they use to buy the land.
Yeah, I was kind of pulling back to the American Indian example. I mean, the American Indian does not work the land. And yet, most likely, his father or grandfather might have died in battle for that land. Could he also say, you know, the work that I did was my work as a warrior and a brave? And so he comes to that American settler who sits there farming it and says, you know what, get off this land or I'm going to take your scalp because it's rightfully mine. My grandfather died for this land. So it doesn't matter if I'm not working it.
Well, if it's his grandfather, it's not actually him, and unless his grandfather held a claim to the land or held a document that claimed, hey, this is the land, this is how I paid for it, etc., then the land isn't his. I don't
Okay.
think.
All right, other questions?
I loved your paper, it's super interesting. So in the Lockean view, as you've discussed, personal property plays a very preeminent role in the way government works and the way citizens interact. And I'm wondering, you know, the notion of physical property is pretty straightforward in the sense of, you own land or you own a building. I'm wondering, what is your perspective, and what do you think Locke's perspective though would have been on the idea of intellectual property, which can be much more controversial in this sense that, for example, private companies in the past have attempted to patent human DNA. What do you think about, what is your perspective on that? What do you think Locke would? Because Locke, you know, personal property is like the foundation of it all. But it seems, I hope you wouldn't take us to this extreme of being like, we can patent DNA, you know?
So, like, can you go further into what you consider like intellectual property? Because I talk to people, everyone has like different kind of ideas and what they perceive. Like, so you said like human DNA
Is an example.
I mean, I would find that wrong if a government would, I mean, a company, unless it's your own DNA, I mean, it's not really yours to, unless a person gave it to them and said, hey, yeah, you can do whatever you want with my DNA. I mean, it's technically not theirs to patent. That's like, it's like you can't patent someone's body. Like, that's technically, I'm not saying that DNA is like equivalent to like a person, but it would be like, or I'm not equivocating it to like slavery so per se, but it's like, hey, I patented you.
Right.
Like,
Well, another example is equations. People, it's illegal to patent equations or general principles of science or physics because, you know, this is, you know, in patent law, this is in general principles, you know, and if someone owns that, then how does science work? You know, you need this sort of common space of knowledge in intellectual property. And so, applying the Lockean view of, you know, everyone has their own thing, and there is, you have this sort of lack of a commons in a sense. I'm just wondering, like, would you treat this differently as physical property? Would you say, yeah, we can apply, you know, the Lockean view to land and houses and roads? When it comes to intellectual property, you know, would you take a different approach from the Lockean view?
I don't, that's an interesting question because Locke was talking about how you have to like work for your property, so you have to work for like, it could be anything, like for, I'm not saying I own this glass, but let's say I bought this glass from Mr. Hendricks. I work for the money that I used to buy the glass, and so I guess in a way, I think that Locke would agree with that because like that's working for the property of something. I don't know if Locke would really completely understand intellectual property in a way. I mean, I'm trying to think about how I can answer your question. I think that, yes, intellectual property is property. I mean, people work hard toward, like, for example, some equations, like, people work really hard. It takes them years before they finally master the equation, and then someone can, like, steal it for their own benefit. And it's like, hey, I worked really hard for that. That took my time, and that's like money that I spent all my time doing that. I could have been doing. So I guess, yeah, I would agree with intellectual property, and I think that Locke would agree with it too. But I think that he would probably hold it to a different standard, or kind of like a different light than land itself.
That makes sense. So like Einstein comes up with relativity. It's like you can't patent that. Like it's a common. Sort of, right.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
says, you know, you own something when you mix your labor with it. Parents produce children. They definitely created that child biologically. So do parents own children as property?
Before the age of 18, technically they are in charge of their child until they are a legal adult unless the child is emancipated. And so I guess technically, I'm not saying that children are slaves or anything like that. I mean, if a parent did that to their kid, then that would be child abuse. But technically, the parents not necessarily own their kids, but they are in charge of deciding how, like for example, the kid is doing something wrong, like he's born free and etc. But the parents are there to keep the kid in line to make sure that he learns his lesson, or he learns like, hey, it's not cool to steal that other kid's Legos or whatever. No?
Why does that change when they turn 18?
Because that's what the law recognizes them as a legal adult, where they can now make their own decisions and they're now members of society.
So does law's theory of property apply only so far as the children are under the age of 18?
I guess, yes, technically when they're under the age of 18, like, I mean, personally right now, I'm 18, but I still live with my parents, and actually I'm still doing one more year of school, so, and we signed certain paperwork, so I'm still technically under their, I don't know what authority, I guess you could say. I don't quite know what you'd say. I wouldn't exactly say that authority is ownership, but they are in charge of their kids and how they act. Like for example, I'm not equating kids to pets or dogs, that's when I say that, but you have a dog and like you own your dog, and so like you make and like the dog has its own will, it does whatever, but you're still like showing it what's like right and wrong, and like you're responsible for anything that your dog does, just like you're responsible for anything that your kid does.
So parents do own their children?
I guess I wouldn't exactly say own them, but I wouldn't exactly use that word. It's not the same as land, but technically.
So what is different then? Like if his theory of labor still applies to this is property, what's difference between owning a child because you made that child and owning a piece of land because you tilled that land?
Well, Locke holds that all men are born with life, liberty, and property, and the difference between land and a child is that child has life and land does not. And so to hold them against their will would be slavery, and that is something that Locke he firmly holds against in his book, The Two Treaties of Government. Although I didn't really mention that too much in my paper, but I think that life is what takes into account the difference of ownership, because I mean the child is a life. You can't say that you own the child because it's their life, they make their own decisions, but you are responsible for the child and everything that they do until they turn 18.
But animals are also alive.
Yeah.
So
But I wouldn't animals don't have free will.
okay.
Humans do. And you can't exactly say like an animal is a slave. Like an animal will, it just identifies you as its owner. A child is, I wouldn't equate a child to an animal. I would say that the circumstances are similar, but they're not the same. They're very, very different from one another.
So is it fair then to say that human beings don't really fit squarely into Locke's idea of property?
I would say that their idea of property that is not life could fit. I think that I think that Locke was talking more about when he was talking about property, he wasn't talking about children or humans. He was very much against slavery. He wasn't talking about life. I think that life is separate from the property that Locke was talking about. Locke was talking about physical property, innate objects, innate things that have no life to them, where they have a conscience and where they have like feelings, emotions, and they're able to like move and have their own free will.
So not animals then?
No, because animals don't have free will, or they don't really have a conscience.
Wait, so they do fit as property or they don't fit as property?
They do fit as property.
But they're alive.
Yes, but they don't have free will or a conscience.
Okay.
Because like that would be slavery. Locke is against slavery. If you say that you own somebody, like that would be slavery, I would say. I mean,
Yes, exactly.
Locke was against slavery, and everyone is born with Locke, he believes that the natural law says that everyone's born with life, liberty, and property. So, or like not was born with the right of life, liberty, and property, not that they're born with it. Excuse me, but I would say that life is separate from an innate object. Like, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yes.
When you say animals don't have free will, are you saying the term free will as in the biblical term, like, you know, the free will versus, like, you know, predestination kind of topic, or that the animals do not have the free will to walk, or like they're not really acting out of their own sense?
I think that animals are working purely off of instinct, and humans have the will and intellect to kind of reason and talk. Like, we're able to have a conversation right now. We're able to fully communicate with one another. A dog and another dog would not have that ability. Like, sure, they can bark, whatever, but it's like purely, I believe they're purely instinctual. And so I would say that instinct would be different from free will. Like, they're able to walk and go forth and do things, but it's instinct over free will.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rohrabacher.